The wind has turned the sea into black glass, and every man aboard the ship can feel the cold reaching through his clothes. There is nowhere to hide, no cabin, no heated room, no modern sleeping bag, just a wooden hull, freezing spray, a sail snapping overhead, and darkness stretching in every direction. And yet, people cross the North Atlantic like this. The Vikings did not merely survive cold water. They built a way of life around it. But there is something strange about the way they stayed warm. Because the answer was not a giant fire. In fact, on many Viking warships, there may not have been a fireplace at all. So if the sea was freezing, the wind was cutting through the ship, and the crew had to sleep on open deck, how did they stop their bodies from losing the fight against the cold? The obvious answer seems simple. They wore fur. They wrapped themselves in thick clothes. They probably sat around fires whenever they could. But that picture creates a problem. A fire on a wooden ship packed with men, sails, ropes, tar, cargo, and weapons is not exactly a comforting idea. One spark could become a catastrophe. And the archaeological evidence suggests that Viking warships were not designed like floating houses. They were designed to move, fast. The famous Longships were low, open vessels. The crew sat on benches and rowed directly from the deck. There were no comfortable cabins waiting below. The Viking Ship Museum notes that Viking-age warships had no fireplace, making hot meals difficult to prepare while underway. Written sources even describe cooks going ashore to prepare food when possible, so the mystery becomes much more interesting. If they couldn't simply heat the ship, they had to heat themselves. And the first part of that solution was something Vikings understood exceptionally well. Wool. Not as a fashion choice, as survival equipment. Viking clothing commonly used wool and linen. Men could wear tunics, trousers, and outer robes, while cloaks, hats, and other garments provided additional protection in cold weather. And wool has one crucial advantage. It can keep insulating even when conditions become damp. That mattered because the cold at sea does not arrive politely. It arrives with wind. It arrives with rain. It arrives as salt water thrown across the deck. And wind is one of the great thieves of body heat. The Vikings could not stop the wind. So they created layers between their skin and the outside world. Linen could sit closer to the body. Wool could trap warmth above it. A cloak could add another barrier. Fur could provide additional insulation for some people. The result was not one magical Viking coat. It was a human insulation system. And that distinction matters, because when you are standing on a modern ship in freezing weather, you might think the solution is one extremely warm jacket. The Vikings had a different problem. Their entire environment was hostile, so warmth had to move with them. But it gets stranger. The Vikings didn't just protect their bodies from the cold. They also protected themselves from the things that made cold dramatically worse. Wind, rain, wet clothing, and exhaustion. Modern sailors recreating Viking voyages discovered just how brutal this combination can become. The Viking Ship Museum's Sea Stallion project found that many layers of wool clothing were essential, while small personal coverings could protect against wind and rain. That sounds almost disappointingly simple, until you remember what the ship looked like. There were no rows of private beds, no heated cabins. No walls separating one sailor from another. The crew slept between the benches. And that created another problem. How do you sleep when the ship is still moving? The answer was not comfort. It was organization. The crew was divided into watches. Some people worked while others rested. Then they switched. The reconstructed Sea Stallion, based on Viking ship design, uses a similar system. Roughly half the crew can rest, while the other half remains responsible for sailing, and sleeping places are arranged around the benches and deck. That system reveals something important. Warmth was not only a clothing problem, it was a time problem. You needed enough rest to keep producing body heat. You needed enough energy to row. You needed enough strength to handle wet clothing, wind, and darkness. And you needed to remain alert when the ship demanded it. A freezing sailor who is exhausted is not simply uncomfortable. He becomes a danger to everyone. So the ship itself became a machine for distributing human energy. Some worked, some slept, some watched. Then they exchanged places. But there is something even more surprising. The Vikings may have had sleeping equipment specifically designed for this environment. Icelandic sources describe a large hide sleeping covering called a hudfat, apparently stitched along the sides and capable of holding two people. And archaeologists have found evidence of another remarkable object: woolen sleeping blankets with a raised, almost sheepskin-like surface. These blankets, known as raya blankets, were found at places including Birka in Sweden and Iceland. Think about what that means. The solution to freezing nights was not necessarily a warm room. It was carrying your shelter on your body. A blanket, a cloak, a hide, a layer of wool, anything that could trap a pocket of warmer air around you. And then something happened that modern people often underestimate. The crew itself became part of the heating system. Dozens of people packed into a relatively small wooden vessel produce heat. They move, they row, they haul ropes, they work together, they breathe, they crowd beneath coverings. There was no central heating. There was collective heating, and that changes the picture completely. The Viking ship wasn't a warm place. It was a place where humans constantly generated enough heat to survive an environment that wanted to take it away. But that creates another problem. What happens when everyone gets wet? Because wool can help. But soaking wet clothing still makes survival harder. And the North Atlantic doesn't care how tough you are. Rain can continue for hours. Spray can cover the deck. Your cloak becomes heavy. Your boots become wet. Your hands become numb. Your body keeps losing heat. So the Vikings needed another strategy. They had to manage exposure. They could not simply fight the weather forever. They had to choose when to sail, when to land, when to rest, when to shelter, when to continue. The Viking ship museum's reconstructed voyages repeatedly show the importance of weather, watches, warm clothing, shelter, and rest. In rough conditions, crew members may sleep wearing their warm clothes and blankets rather than being sealed inside modern sleeping bags, because they need to get up quickly if the ship is threatened. And this reveals something that popular images of Vikings often miss. Their greatest survival technology may not have been a weapon. It may have been discipline. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a task. Everyone had to understand that their individual survival depended on the people around them. If one sailor failed to bail water, everyone could suffer. If someone fell asleep during a watch, everyone could be exposed. If someone became dangerously cold, they could lose the ability to work. The cold therefore became a social problem, not just a physical one. And that is where the story starts becoming uncomfortable. Because we tend to imagine ancient people as tougher versions of ourselves. They weren't. Their bodies were still human. They could become exhausted. They could become hypothermic. They could become sick. They could freeze. The difference was that they lived in a world where the consequences arrived faster. There was no emergency helicopter, no heated rescue boat, no insulated survival suit, no weather app warning you that a storm is approaching. If your body lost too much heat in the middle of the ocean won. So perhaps the real Viking achievement was not discovering some forgotten trick that made freezing water harmless. Maybe it was learning to respect the limits of the human body. And that matters because we still struggle with the same problem. We have simply hidden it beneath technology. Your house is warm because a machine moves heat from one place to another. Your car can become warm in minutes. Your clothes can be engineered from synthetic materials. Your phone can tell you the temperature outside before you even open the door. But remove those systems, remove the walls, remove the heating, remove the waterproof clothing, put yourself on an open wooden deck at night. Suddenly, the Viking solution begins to make terrifying sense. You would layer your clothes. You would cover your head. You would protect yourself from wind. You would keep dry. You would sleep whenever you were allowed. You would stay close to other people. And you would never forget that the cold was not your enemy, because it was powerful. It was your enemy, because it was patient. It did not need to attack you. It only needed to keep taking a little heat, a little more, and a little more, until your body could no longer replace what the environment was stealing. That may be the strangest thing about Viking survival. They didn't conquer the cold. They negotiated with it. Every cloak was a negotiation. Every blanket was a negotiation. Every watch rotation was a negotiation. Every decision to seek shelter was a negotiation. And the ship itself was part of that bargain. Its open design gave it speed. Its low profile helped it move through shallow waters. Its lack of heavy structures made it remarkably efficient, but those advantages came at a price: comfort, privacy, protection, warmth. The Viking ship was built to travel through a dangerous world, not to make that world comfortable. And perhaps that is why the surviving evidence feels so haunting. When archaeologists uncover a Viking ship, they don't find a floating medieval hotel, they find benches, wood, oars, sails, equipment, the remains of a machine designed to keep moving. And somewhere between those benches, people once slept beneath wool and hide while the sea moved beneath them. They were cold, they were tired, they were wet, and then, when the watch changed, they got up anyway. That is the part that makes the Viking story difficult to romanticize. Their survival was not effortless toughness. It was adaptation repeated over and over again. A layer of wool, a dry cloak, a blanket, a sheltered coastline, a carefully timed journey, a sleeping partner, a watch that ends before exhaustion becomes dangerous. Thousands of small decisions standing between a human body and the ocean. And perhaps the final mystery isn't how Vikings stayed warm. Perhaps it is how humans became so good at living inside environments that were never designed for us. Because the Vikings were not immune to the cold, they simply learned how to lose heat more slowly. And when you think about it, that is what much of human civilization really is. Not the elimination of danger. The construction of tiny barriers between ourselves and it. A wall between us and winter. A roof between us and rain. Clothing between us and wind. A ship between us and the ocean. And sometimes, only a thin layer of wool between a living human being and a world cold enough to kill them. The Vikings knew something we often forget. Survival does not always look like defeating the environment. Sometimes it looks like becoming just clever enough to endure it. And somewhere, beneath the roar of a northern sea, a wooden ship once carried men through darkness with nothing but wool, wood, teamwork, and the heat of their own bodies. The sea was still freezing, the wind was still merciless. Nothing around them had become safer. They had simply learned how to remain human inside it. And maybe that is the unsettling part, because the technology was never really the ship, it was the people inside it.